In the world of military operations, there are heroes whose names make headlines and legends whose stories are told in movies. But sometimes the person who saves the most lives never gets their picture on a magazine cover. Sometimes the voice that prevents disaster belongs to someone the world dismisses as just support staff. This is the story of Sarah Chun, a 23-year-old communications specialist who everyone at the base called the radio girl. While others carried weapons into battle, she carried frequencies and call signs. While others planned tactical strikes, she monitored endless hours of static-filled transmissions. The senior officers barely knew her name, and the media never interviewed her. But on one fateful night in Afghanistan, when America's most elite fighting force walked straight into what should have been certain death, it wasn't their training, weapons, or tactical superiority that saved them. It was the voice of a young woman who refused to be invisible, who turned being underestimated into her greatest weapon. What happened that night would change everything, not just for SEAL Team 6, but for how the military world viewed the quiet heroes working behind the scenes. Because sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody's paying attention to. Sarah Chun never intended to become invisible, but that's exactly what happened the moment she stepped into Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan. At 23, with her slight frame and quiet demeanor, she seemed to disappear into the background noise of military operations. The soldiers called her the radio girl, not out of disrespect, but because most of them genuinely didn't know her name. To them, she was just another piece of equipment, useful when needed, forgotten when not. The base buzzed with the constant energy of America's war machine. Helicopters thundered overhead, armored vehicles rumbled across the compound, and elite soldiers prepared for missions that would never make the evening news. In this world of controlled chaos, Sarah occupied a small concrete bunker filled with communications equipment that most people walked past without a second glance. Her official title was Communications Specialist, but Sarah understood her real role better than anyone. She was the voice in the darkness, the lifeline between teams in hostile territory and their commanders back at base. While others slept, she sat hunched over radio consoles, tracking multiple operations simultaneously, her headphones pressed tight against her ears as she filtered through layers of static to catch the faintest whisper of trouble. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Oregon, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who ran a family restaurant. Her parents had worked 18-hour days to build their American dream, and they'd instilled in their daughter the same relentless work ethic. But while they understood the value of hard work in the restaurant business, they couldn't quite grasp why their brilliant daughter had chosen the military over college. The truth was, Sarah had tried college. She'd earned a full scholarship to study computer science at a prestigious university, but something about the sterile academic environment had felt wrong to her. She craved purpose, real stakes, the kind of work where her skills could make an immediate difference. When she discovered she had an almost supernatural ability to process multiple audio streams simultaneously and detect patterns others missed, the military seemed like the obvious choice. Basic training had been a shock. Sarah was used to being the smartest person in the room, but here, intelligence was just one factor among many. Physical strength, leadership presence, and the ability to command respect all seemed more important than her technical skills. She watched as her fellow recruits, many of them men who could barely operate their smartphones, were fast-tracked into prestigious programs while she was assigned to communications. Her first sergeant, a gruff career military man named Rodriguez, had noticed her disappointment during their initial evaluation. "You think this is a consolation prize," he'd said, gesturing toward the radio equipment. You think this is where we put the people who can't cut it in the real action? Sarah had nodded, too young and too honest to hide her feelings. Rodriguez had laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. Girl, let me tell you something. In my 20 years in this man's army, I've seen heroes and I've seen cowards, and most of the time, the difference between them isn't courage. It's information. The bravest soldier in the world is just dead meat if they don't know where they're going or who's shooting at them. You want to save lives? Master those radios. Those words had stuck with Sarah throughout her training and deployment. She threw herself into learning every aspect of military communications, from basic radio protocols to advanced encryption systems. She studied voice recognition, learned to identify different types of weapons by their sound signatures, and practiced filtering out background noise until she could hear a whisper in a thunderstorm. But technical skills were only part of what made Sarah exceptional. She possessed an almost mystical ability to read between the lines of military communications. While others heard requests for ammunition, she heard desperation in the slight crack of a voice. Where others heard routine position reports, she detected the subtle changes in speech patterns that indicated extreme stress or injury. Her colleagues at the base appreciated her skills, but they didn't really understand the depth of her abilities. To them, she was reliable, efficient, and unremarkable. Captain Morrison, the operations officer, would nod approvingly when her reports were accurate, but he'd never taken the time to understand how she gathered her information. Major Williams, who oversaw the communications department, valued her consistency, but saw her as interchangeable with any other competent technician. The attitude wasn't malicious. In the military's hierarchical structure, communication specialists were viewed as support personnel, essential but not glamorous. The real heroes were the ones who kicked down doors and faced enemy fire. The stories that got told in the mess hall were about daring raids and narrow escapes, not about the patient work of monitoring radio frequencies for hours on end. Sarah had learned to accept this reality, but it still stung sometimes. She'd grown up believing that competence and dedication would be rewarded with recognition and advancement. Instead, she discovered a world where being exceptional at her job often meant being overlooked for more visible positions. The irony wasn't lost on her. In civilian life, her technical skills would have made her incredibly valuable. Tech companies would have competed to hire someone with her abilities. But in the military, those same skills made her invisible, relegated to the background of more dramatic narratives. Still, Sarah found satisfaction in her work. Every night, as she settled into her station surrounded by glowing screens and crackling radios, she felt the weight of responsibility. Somewhere out in the Afghan darkness, soldiers were counting on her to be their link to safety. Whether they knew her name or not, their lives depended on her vigilance. The work was monotonous and demanding. Sarah would often spend 12 to 14 hours straight monitoring communications, tracking multiple operations while maintaining detailed logs of every transmission. Her eyes would burn from staring at screens. Her back would ache from sitting in uncomfortable chairs, and her ears would ring from hours of wearing headphones. But she'd also developed an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield around Forward Operating Base Chapman. She knew which patrol was running late before their commander did. She could predict supply shortages by listening to the subtle changes in logistics communications. She'd learned to recognize the voices of individual soldiers across dozens of units, tracking their moods and stress levels like a doctor monitoring vital signs. The other communications specialists respected her abilities, but even they didn't fully understand what made her different. Sergeant Martinez, Her immediate supervisor often joked that Sarah had golden ears, but he said it the way someone might comment on a useful piece of equipment. He valued her skills without really seeing the person behind them. Sarah had tried to share her insights with the command staff, but her suggestions were usually met with polite indifference. When she'd warned about potential security breaches based on patterns she'd detected in enemy communications, her reports were filed away without action. When she'd identified opportunities for more efficient coordination between units, her recommendations disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of military hierarchy. She'd learned to keep her observations to herself, focusing on her assigned duties while quietly building a comprehensive understanding of the theater of operations that exceeded that of officers with decades more experience. Sarah knew the terrain, the enemy patterns, and the capabilities of every friendly unit better than almost anyone else on the base. But knowledge without authority was a frustrating combination. Sarah could see problems developing days in advance, but she had no power to address them. She could predict where units might run into trouble, but her warnings were filtered through layers of command that diluted their urgency. She felt like Cassandra from Greek mythology, cursed with accurate prophecies that no one would believe. The loneliness of her position was perhaps the hardest part. Sarah worked mostly alone, surrounded by sophisticated equipment, but isolated from the camaraderie that sustained other soldiers. While her colleagues shared meals and stories, she was usually hunched over her radios, listening to distant voices and trying to piece together the bigger picture of military operations. Her family back home couldn't understand what she did or why it mattered. During rare phone calls, her parents would ask when she was coming home, unable to grasp why their brilliant daughter was wasting her talents in what seemed like a dead-end military job. Her friends from high school had moved on with their lives, starting careers and families while Sarah sat in a bunker thousands of miles away, listening to static. But Sarah persevered because she understood something her superiors didn't quite grasp. She wasn't just monitoring communications. She was maintaining the nervous system of military operations. Every voice that crackled through her headphones represented real people facing real danger. Every transmission she relayed accurately might mean the difference between a successful mission and a tragedy. As winter approached in Afghanistan, Sarah noticed subtle changes in enemy communications patterns. The intercepted chatter suggested increased activity in the mountains surrounding their base, but the intelligence analyst dismissed her reports as routine seasonal fluctuations. Sarah knew better. She'd been listening to these frequencies for months, and something was different. The enemy was planning something big, and Sarah was one of the few people positioned to see it coming. But she was also just the radio girl, and her warnings carried little weight in the corridors of power at Forward Operating Base Chapman. What she didn't know was that her moment to prove her worth was approaching faster than anyone imagined. And when it came, the lives of America's most elite warriors would depend entirely on her ability to be heard above the static. The mission briefing for Operation Silent Thunder took place at 1800 hours on a cold November evening, but Sarah wasn't invited. She learned about it the way she learned about most classified operations, by listening to the preparation chatter that leaked through various communication channels as the team made ready. SEAL Team 6 was deploying that night, though their official designation and mission details were compartmentalized far above Sarah's security clearance. What she could piece together from overheard conversations and communication protocols was troubling. The team was heading into the Korangal Valley, a notoriously dangerous area that local forces avoided after dark. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was meeting with regional Taliban commanders at a compound approximately 15 kilometers north of the base. Sarah had been monitoring communications in that sector for weeks, and what she'd heard didn't match the confident tone of the pre-mission briefings. The enemy chatter she'd intercepted suggested something more complex than a simple leadership meeting. References to special guests and the gift had appeared repeatedly in decoded transmissions, along with unusual movement patterns that indicated far more activity than a routine gathering would require. But Sarah's concerns hadn't made it past the initial intelligence screening. Her reports were thorough and well documented, but they lacked the dramatic certainty that commanders preferred. Where the official intelligence painted a clear picture of opportunity, Sarah saw ambiguity and potential danger. Her warnings were noted and filed, but they didn't change the mission parameters. As darkness fell over Forward Operating Base Chapman, Sarah settled into her station with a growing sense of unease. The SEAL team had departed at 2,130 hours, using a flight path that would keep them below enemy radar until the final approach. Their communication protocols called for minimal radio contact during the insertion phase, which meant Sarah would have limited ability to track their progress until they reached the target area. The team consisted of 8 operators, each a veteran of dozens of similar missions. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell, had earned a reputation for tactical brilliance and cool decision-making under pressure. His call sign was Tried and Actual, and Sarah had monitored enough of his previous operations to recognize his distinctive communication style: precise, economical, and completely professional. The first 3 hours of the mission proceeded according to plan. Sarah tracked the team's progress through routine check-ins and coordination with aerial support units. The helicopters reported clean insertions and no signs of enemy activity in the immediate area. The SEAL team moved through their predetermined waypoints without incident, maintaining communication discipline while navigating the treacherous mountain terrain. But at approximately 0045 hours, Sarah began hearing transmissions that made her blood run cold. The intercepted enemy communications she'd been monitoring showed a sudden spike in activity. Multiple groups were reporting movement in the Korangal Valley, and their chatter had taken on an excited, anticipatory tone that Sarah had learned to recognize as a precursor to ambush operations. More disturbing were the references to American forces that suggested the enemy had advanced knowledge of the SEAL team's mission. While Sarah couldn't decode every transmission, the patterns were unmistakable. Someone had leaked operational details, and the Taliban was preparing a reception that would turn Operation Silent Thunder into a massacre. Sarah immediately began documenting what she was hearing, but the chain of command for passing intelligence during active operations was slow and bureaucratic. Her immediate supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, was off duty, and the watch officer, Lieutenant Barnes, was coordinating multiple operations simultaneously. Even if Sarah could get his attention, convincing him to redirect a SEAL team based on intercepted chatter would require explanations and approvals that could take hours. Meanwhile, Tried and Actual was reporting normal progress as the team approached the target compound. Their communications indicated they were approximately 30 minutes from the objective, moving through terrain that offered limited cover and fewer escape routes. If Sarah was right about the ambush, the SEAL team was walking into a killing field with no awareness of the danger. The intercepted enemy transmissions were becoming more specific. Sarah could hear references to 8 Americans and coordinate exchanges that matched the SEAL team's route of approach. The Taliban fighters were positioning themselves along the team's expected withdrawal path, setting up a coordinated attack that would trap the operators in a crossfire with minimal chances of survival. Sarah made a decision that violated every protocol in her training manual. Instead of following proper channels, she switched to the emergency frequency that SEAL teams monitored for urgent communications. Her hands shook as she keyed the microphone, knowing that breaking communication discipline during a classified operation could end her military career. Tried in actual, "This is base communications with urgent traffic," she transmitted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The response came back immediately, crisp and professional. "Base communications, tried in actual. Send your traffic." Sarah took a deep breath and delivered the warning that would save 8 lives and change her own forever. "Tried in actual, be advised we're intercepting enemy communications indicating possible ambush at your objective. Multiple hostile elements appear to have advanced knowledge of your mission and are positioning for coordinated attack on your withdrawal route." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Sarah could imagine Lieutenant Commander Mitchell processing this information, weighing the credibility of an unknown voice against his mission objectives and the intelligence that had sent his team into harm's way. "Base communications, can you confirm source and reliability of this intelligence?" Mitchell's voice carried a new edge of tension. "Tried in actual, source is ongoing intercept of local enemy communications. I've been monitoring this frequency set for 6 weeks and can confirm unusual activity patterns consistent with pre-planned ambush operations." Sarah's response was professional, but she knew she was staking her credibility on patterns and instincts that would be difficult to explain in an after-action report. Again, silence. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in her headphones as she waited for Mitchell's response. She'd done everything she could to warn them, but the decision to abort or continue the mission belonged to the team leader. "Base communications, tried in actual. Request immediate ISR support to confirm possible hostile positions along Route Bravo." Mitchell was asking for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to verify Sarah's warning, a reasonable request that would take at least 20 minutes to fulfill. Sarah looked at her screens and realized they didn't have 20 minutes. The enemy communications were reaching a crescendo of preparation that suggested the ambush was set and ready. If the SEAL team continued toward the objective, they would walk into the trap before any confirmation could arrive. "Tried in actual, recommend immediate egress via alternate route. Enemy transmissions indicate imminent threat timeline." Sarah was pushing the boundaries of her authority, but she couldn't watch 8 American soldiers die because of bureaucratic procedures. This time, Mitchell's response came quickly. "Base communications, understand recommendation for immediate egress. Break. All Trident elements, prepare for route change to alternate extraction point. We are aborting primary mission." Relief flooded through Sarah as she heard the SEAL team acknowledging their new orders. But her work was far from over. As the team began moving towards safety, the intercepted enemy communications revealed the depth of the threat they'd just avoided. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves in an elaborate kill zone that would have decimated the SEAL team if they'd reached the target compound. The enemy's reaction to the aborted mission confirmed Sarah's worst fears about operational security. Within minutes of the team's withdrawal, the Taliban commanders were discussing how their American source had been wrong about the timing. Someone with access to classified information was feeding intelligence to the enemy, and Sarah had just disrupted a coordinated effort to eliminate America's most elite military unit. As the SEAL team moved toward their alternate extraction point, Sarah continued monitoring enemy communications and tracking friendly forces. The Taliban was scrambling to reposition their fighters, trying to intercept the retreating Americans before they could reach safety. Sarah found herself coordinating between the SEAL team, their air support, and the quick reaction force that was being prepared in case extraction became complicated. For the first time in her military career, Sarah was at the center of a critical operation rather than watching from the sidelines. Her warnings had prevented a massacre, but now she was helping coordinate the complex dance of withdrawal that would bring the team home safely. Every transmission she relayed and every piece of intelligence she provided was directly impacting the lives of 8 soldiers moving through hostile territory. The extraction went smoothly, thanks partly to Sarah's continued monitoring of enemy communications that allowed the team to avoid several Taliban units that were attempting to intercept them. When the helicopters finally lifted off with all 8 SEAL operators safely aboard, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment that no previous mission had provided. But even as she celebrated the successful outcome, Sarah understood that her actions would have consequences. She'd broken protocol, violated the chain of command, and interfered with a classified operation based on her own analysis of intercepted intelligence. While the results had been positive, the military bureaucracy wouldn't necessarily view her initiative as commendable. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice came through her headphones one final time as his team headed back to base. Base communications, tried in actual. Outstanding work tonight. Request your name and unit for my after-action report. Sarah keyed her microphone and provided the information, knowing that this moment marked a turning point in her military career. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the radio girl who could be safely ignored. Her actions had saved lives and exposed a security breach that threatened ongoing operations. As dawn approached over forward operating base Chapman, Sarah began preparing the detailed reports that would be required to explain her decisions and justify her actions. She knew that the coming days would bring intense scrutiny from officers who hadn't been in her position during those critical moments when 8 lives hung in the balance. What Sarah didn't know was that her warning had prevented more than just an ambush. The intelligence she'd gathered about enemy communications would lead to the discovery of a sophisticated spy ring that had been operating inside the base for months. The American source the Taliban had referenced would be traced to a contractor with access to mission planning, and several other compromised operations would be reevaluated based on her analysis. The quiet young woman who'd been dismissed as support personnel had just proved that sometimes the most important person in a military operation is the one nobody's paying attention to. But with recognition would come new challenges, new responsibilities, and new dangers that Sarah couldn't yet imagine. The debriefing began at 0800 hours sharp, just 6 hours after SEAL Team 6 had returned safely from their aborted mission. Sarah sat in a sterile conference room at Forward Operating Base Chapman, surrounded by officers whose ranks far exceeded her own. The assembled group included Major Williams from Communications, Captain Morrison from Operations, Lieutenant Colonel Davis from Intelligence, and Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, whose life she'd helped save just hours earlier. Sarah had never been in a room with so much collective military authority, and the weight of their attention was both gratifying and terrifying. For months, she'd been invisible to these same officers, a competent but unremarkable technician who processed their communications without warranting their notice. Now she was the center of a discussion that could reshape how the military viewed intelligence gathering and operational security. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell began the session by providing his perspective on the previous night's events. His account was precise and professional, detailing how the warning from base communications had prompted him to abort a mission that subsequent analysis confirmed would have been disastrous. The enemy positions discovered after the team's withdrawal matched exactly the threat Sarah had described in her urgent transmission. The intelligence provided by Specialist Chun prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. Mitchell concluded, his eyes meeting Sarah's across the conference table. Her warning was timely, accurate, and delivered with appropriate urgency. Without her intervention, my entire team would likely have been killed or captured. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications of Mitchell's statement. Sarah could see various emotions playing across their faces: surprise, calculation, and, in some cases, embarrassment. These were experienced military leaders who prided themselves on protecting their people, and they were grappling with the realization that their most junior communications specialist had seen a threat they'd missed entirely. Major Williams was the first to speak, his voice carefully neutral. "Specialist Chun, can you walk us through how you identified this threat? Your analysis appears to have contradicted our official intelligence assessment." Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that her unconventional approach to intelligence gathering would need careful explanation. She opened the detailed report she'd prepared during the early morning hours, complete with transcripts of intercepted communications and analysis of pattern changes she'd observed over several weeks. "Sir, I've been monitoring enemy communications in the Karangal Valley sector for approximately 6 weeks prior to last night's mission," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "During that period, I documented several anomalies in communication patterns that suggested increased coordination between normally independent Taliban units." Sarah proceeded to outline her findings with a methodical precision that had made her exceptional at her job. She described how she'd learned to recognize individual voices among enemy communicators, how she'd mapped their operational territories, and how she detected the subtle changes in their behavior that indicated advanced planning for a major operation. The officers listened with growing attention as Sarah explained her analysis. She showed them how references to special guests and the gift had appeared in multiple intercepted transmissions, always in connection with coordinates that matched the SEAL team's target location. She demonstrated how the timing of increased communications activity correlated with the mission planning timeline in ways that suggested inside knowledge of American operations. Lieutenant Colonel Davis interrupted with a sharp question. "Specialist Chun, are you suggesting that our operational security was compromised? That enemy forces had advanced knowledge of a classified SEAL mission?" Sarah met his gaze directly, knowing that her answer would have far-reaching implications. "Yes, sir. The pattern of enemy communications strongly suggests they had detailed knowledge of the mission timeline, route of approach, and target location. They were prepared to execute a coordinated ambush that could only have been planned with advanced intelligence." The room erupted in urgent conversations as the officers began discussing the security implications of Sarah's assessment. If she was correct, the base had a serious intelligence leak that threatened all ongoing operations. The enemy's ability to predict American missions would have to be investigated immediately, and several other recent operations would need to be reevaluated for possible compromise. Captain Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "Specialist Chen, why wasn't this analysis included in the pre-mission intelligence briefing? Your observations could have prevented the mission from launching in the first place." Sarah felt her cheeks flush as she prepared to address the bureaucratic failures that had nearly resulted in tragedy. "Sir, I submitted multiple intelligence reports documenting these anomalies over the past 3 weeks. Each report was filed through proper channels, but I received no feedback or acknowledgement that the information was being incorporated into operational planning." The silence that followed was uncomfortable as the officers realized they were facing a systemic failure in their intelligence processing. Sarah's warnings had been properly submitted and correctly formatted, but they've been lost in the bureaucratic maze that filtered information upward through the command structure. Major Williams cleared his throat, his voice carrying a note of defensive embarrassment. Specialist Chin's reports were reviewed by the intelligence section, but they were assessed as routine intercept data rather than actionable intelligence. The patterns she identified weren't immediately obvious to analysts who weren't monitoring the communications in real time. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's response was sharp and direct. With respect, Major, the quality of intelligence analysis shouldn't depend on whether the analyst happens to agree with the conclusions. Specialist Chin's reports deserved more thorough evaluation, particularly given her track record for accurate assessment. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the SEAL officer who was defending her work, but she also recognized the dangerous position she was in. By exposing the failure of the intelligence system, she was potentially embarrassing officers who had the power to destroy her military career. The same initiative that had saved lives could be viewed as insubordination if the wrong people decided to make an example of her. But Lieutenant Colonel Davis surprised her with his next statement. Specialist Chun, your analysis and initiative last night represent exactly the kind of intelligence work we need more of in this theater. You demonstrated the ability to synthesize complex information, identify patterns that others missed, and take appropriate action under pressure. These are rare and valuable skills. The praise felt surreal after months of being ignored and underestimated, but Sarah sensed that recognition would come with new challenges. The military didn't easily admit its mistakes, and her success highlighted systematic problems that would need to be addressed. The debriefing continued for another 2 hours as Sarah walked the officers through her methodology for monitoring communications, analyzing patterns, and identifying threats. She demonstrated the sophisticated tracking systems she'd developed on her own initiative, showing how she maintained detailed profiles of enemy units and their operational habits. What impressed the officers most was the depth of Sarah's understanding of the battle space around their base. While they'd been focused on immediate tactical concerns, she'd been building a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions that exceeded the knowledge of intelligence analysts with decades of experience. Captain Morrison asked the question that had been hanging in the air throughout the discussion. Specialist Chun, how would you recommend we modify our intelligence processes to better utilize the kind of analysis you've been conducting? Sarah had thought carefully about this question, knowing it represented an opportunity to address the systemic problems that had nearly led to disaster. Sir, I believe we need to create better channels for bottom-up intelligence reporting. The analysts who spend the most time monitoring specific communications often develop insights that aren't captured in formal reports. We need systems that encourage and reward this kind of pattern recognition. She also recommended creating cross-functional teams that would bring together technical specialists like herself with operational planners and intelligence analysts. The siloed approach that kept communications specialists isolated from mission planning had prevented valuable insights from reaching decision-makers. The discussion revealed broader problems with how the military utilized its technical specialists. Sarah's skills in pattern recognition and communications analysis were exactly what modern warfare required, but the traditional military hierarchy wasn't designed to elevate such expertise. The officers in the room were beginning to understand that winning against sophisticated enemies would require new approaches to intelligence and decision-making. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell asked Sarah to brief him privately after the formal debriefing concluded. In a smaller conference room, with just the two of them present, he provided a perspective on the previous night's events that the larger group hadn't heard. Specialist Chun, I need you to understand what your warning prevented, Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much combat. The ambush position the enemy had prepared would have killed or capture my entire team. 8 operators with years of training and dozens of successful missions would have been lost because our intelligence failed to identify a clear threat. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But more than that, the intelligence leak you identified has implications far beyond one mission. If the enemy has a source inside our operations, every American soldier in this theater is at risk. Your analysis may have exposed a spy ring that's been operating for months. Sarah felt the full weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She'd prevented one tragedy, but she'd also uncovered evidence of a much larger problem that threatened ongoing operations and American lives throughout Afghanistan. Mitchell continued, I've recommended you for immediate promotion and transfer to a joint task force that's being formed to address intelligence coordination problems. Your skills are too valuable to waste on routine communications monitoring. The offer represented everything Sarah had hoped for when she'd enlisted: recognition, advancement, and the chance to make a meaningful contribution to important missions. But she also understood that accepting would mean leaving the familiar world of radio communications for the complex and dangerous realm of counterintelligence operations. Sir, what about the investigation into the intelligence leak? Sarah asked, knowing that her analysis would be crucial to identifying the source of compromised information. That investigation is already underway, Mitchell replied. Your intercept data has provided leads that our counterintelligence teams are following up on. We believe the leak comes from someone with access to mission planning, possibly a contractor or civilian employee. Your continued analysis will be essential to building a case. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of the most important counterintelligence investigation at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Her ability to analyze communications patterns proved invaluable in tracking how information flowed from American planning sessions to enemy communications networks. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of a civilian contractor who'd been providing detailed intelligence to Taliban commanders in exchange for substantial payments. The spy ring had compromised numerous operations over several months, leading to American casualties that could have been prevented if the security breach had been detected earlier. Sarah's role in exposing the spy ring earned her a Bronze Star Medal and promotion to sergeant. More importantly, it led to systematic changes in how the military processed intelligence from technical specialists. Her recommendations for better integration between communications monitoring and operational planning were implemented across multiple bases, potentially saving countless lives in future operations. The young woman who'd been dismissed as just the radio girl had proved that expertise and initiative could triumph over bureaucratic indifference. Her story became a case study in military schools, demonstrating how critical intelligence could come from unexpected sources if organizations were willing to listen to their most dedicated people. But perhaps the most important outcome of that night in November was personal. Sarah had found her purpose and proved her worth in a system that had initially undervalued her contributions. She'd transformed from an invisible technician into a recognized expert whose voice carried weight in the most important discussions about military operations. Years later, after completing multiple deployments and earning advanced training in counterintelligence operations, Sarah would reflect on the night that changed everything. She'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage if she was willing to work harder and dig deeper than anyone expected. The radio that had once seemed like a barrier between her and recognition had become the instrument through which she'd saved lives and changed how the military fought its most important battles. The girl who nobody noticed had become the woman everyone listened to, proving that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person nobody's paying attention to.